December 3rd, 1958. 5:42 in the morning, Phoenix, Arizona. A butcher knife rests on a blood-soaked carpet in a ranch house at 440 East Baseline Road. The bedroom walls are spattered red. 2 bodies lie in separate rooms, their throats cut with such violence that neighbors will later tell police they heard nothing. No screams, no struggle. Just the desert wind pushing through the citrus groves that surround this upscale neighborhood where doctors and businessmen sleep behind locked doors. Gus Greenbaum is dead at 64. His wife Bess is dead beside him. The killers came in darkness, moved through the house like surgeons, and left before dawn broke over Camelback Mountain. When Phoenix homicide detectives arrive at sunrise, they will find a scene so brutal it suggests something beyond murder. This is a message. This is a lesson written in blood for anyone else who might think about stealing from Meyer Lansky. The story of how Gus Greenbaum ended up on that bedroom floor begins 11 years earlier and 300 miles northwest, in a pink stucco palace rising from the Nevada desert like a mirage. It begins with another murder, another gambler, and the moment organized crime decided to bet everything on a stretch of highway that most Americans had never heard of. June 20th, 1947, Beverly Hills, California. Benjamin Bugsy Siegel sits on a chintz sofa in Virginia Hills mansion at 810 North Linden Drive, reading the Los Angeles Times. At 41, he is handsome, volatile, and deeply in debt to the men who built him. The Flamingo Hotel and Casino, his dream project in Las Vegas, has been bleeding money for 6 months. $6 million of mob money. Meyer Lansky's money. Lucky Luciano's money. The commission has given Siegel chance after chance to turn it around, but the numbers don't lie. The Flamingo is a disaster. At 10:45 p.m., 9 rounds from a .30 caliber M1 carbine shatter the living room window. 2 bullets strike Siegel in the head. 1 exits through his left eye, which police will later find 15 feet from his body. He dies instantly, slumped on the sofa with the newspaper still in his lap. The killers vanish into the Hollywood Hills. No witnesses, no arrests, no one talks. 20 minutes later, before the coroner even arrives, 2 men walk through the front doors of the Flamingo Hotel. Morris Rosen and Gus Greenbaum. They carry briefcases and a mandate from Meyer Lansky. Take control, stop the bleeding, make this place profitable, or we shut it down and walk away from the entire Nevada experiment. Greenbaum knows what this means. This is his chance, his test. The commission is watching. Gus Greenbaum was born in 1894 in New York City, the son of Jewish immigrants from Eastern Europe who fled the pogroms and persecution that swept through Russia and Poland in the 1880s. His father worked as a tailor in a cramped shop on Orchard Street, stitching suits for pennies while his mother took in laundry. They lived in a 5th-floor walk-up in a building where 8 families shared 1 bathroom, and the smell of boiled cabbage and coal smoke hung in the stairwells like fog. The Lower East Side in the 1890s was a pressure cooker of poverty, ambition, and survival. Italian families lived next to Irish families, next to Jewish families, all of them scrambling for work, for food, for a foothold in America. The streets were ruled by gangs, the 5 Points Gang, the Eastmans, the Monk Eastman crew. Young men who understood that the law was something rich men used to keep poor men in line. Gus learned early. You didn't trust cops, you didn't trust politicians, you didn't trust anyone who said they were there to help you. The only thing you could trust was family, and even then, you watched your back. He had a brother, 10 years older, who everyone called Jake the Barber. Jacob Guzik. Smart, ruthless, and cold as winter. Jake started out running errands for local bookmakers, then graduated to managing prostitution rings, then became the financial genius behind the Chicago outfit. When Al Capone needed someone to launder his bootlegging profits through legitimate businesses, he called Jake Guzik. When the feds came sniffing around, Jake had the books clean and the witnesses silent. He was the man who made Capone untouchable, until the IRS finally brought them both down on tax evasion in 1931. But that was later. In 1910, Jake was already in Chicago building his empire. And Gus, 16 years old and watching his brothers rise, decided he didn't want to be a tailor. He didn't want to spend his life bent over a sewing machine in some sweatshop, coughing up lint and dying poor. He wanted what Jake had: power, money, respect. So he went west. By 1920, Gus Greenbaum was in Phoenix, Arizona, a dusty frontier town with more cattle than people, where the temperature hit 115 degrees in summer, and the only entertainment was drinking, gambling, and waiting for the monsoon rains to break the heat. Phoenix was wide open. Gambling was illegal on paper, but every saloon had a back room where you could play poker, shoot craps, or bet on horse races transmitted over telegraph wires from tracks in California, New York, and Kentucky. Greenbaum saw opportunity. He set up a wire service, a bookmaking operation that took bets on out-of-state races and paid out winnings based on telegraph results. It was simple, efficient, and enormously profitable. Gamblers loved it because they could bet on races they'd never see. Greenbaum loved it because the house edge was built in, and as long as he managed the books carefully, he couldn't lose. But running a wire service required connections. You needed access to telegraph lines, which meant paying off Western Union operators. You needed protection from local law enforcement, which meant paying off cops, sheriffs, and judges. And you needed capital to cover big payouts when a long-shot horse came in. Greenbaum built those connections methodically. He paid his bribes on time. He never shorted a winner. He kept his operations low profile, never flashy, never making headlines. Within 5 years, he controlled most of the illegal gambling in Phoenix, and he did it without firing a shot or making an enemy. In 1925, he married Bess Lederer, the daughter of a local merchant. She was quiet, devout, and stayed out of his business. They bought a house in a respectable neighborhood, joined a synagogue, and lived like any other middle-class couple. Gus wore suits, paid his taxes, and donated to charity. To anyone looking, he was a legitimate businessman, a pillar of the community. Behind closed doors, he was counting money from every crooked card game, horse race, and dice table in Arizona. The 1930s brought the Great Depression, but Greenbaum's business barely slowed. People always gamble when they're broke. They're chasing hope, chasing the fantasy that one good bet will change their lives. Greenbaum understood that. He kept his odds fair enough that winners kept coming back, but tight enough that the house always profited. And then he got noticed. Meyer Lansky, already the financial architect of the National Crime Syndicate, heard about a bookmaker in Phoenix who ran a clean operation, paid his debts, and never caused problems. Lansky was building a network of illegal gambling operations across the country, and he needed reliable operators in every major city. Phoenix was a small market, but it was growing. And Gus Greenbaum had exactly the skills Lansky valued: discipline, discretion, and mathematical precision. Lansky reached out through intermediaries, nothing formal, just a quiet conversation about mutual interests. Greenbaum understood immediately. This wasn't a request. This was an invitation into a much larger game. By 1935, Greenbaum's wire service was plugged into Lansky's national network. He was laundering money from syndicate operations in Los Angeles, San Francisco, and Chicago. He was passing information about high rollers and big bettors. He was, in the language of the underworld, a connected guy. Not a made man. He was Jewish, so he could never be formally inducted into the Italian Mafia, but close enough that his name carried weight. And crucially, Lansky trusted him. Not with his life, not with his secrets, but with his money. And in the mob, that was the highest compliment you could receive. World War II changed everything. Suddenly Nevada was booming. The federal government built military bases across the desert. Nellis Air Force Base, the Las Vegas Army Airfield, the basic magnesium plant in Henderson. Thousands of soldiers, pilots, and defense workers flooded into the state, and they all had money to spend and time to kill. Las Vegas, a sleepy railroad town with a few casinos and a lot of desert, became a boomtown. The mob saw the opportunity immediately. In most states, gambling was illegal, but Nevada had legalized it in 1931, desperate for tax revenue during the Depression. The law was intended to help local businesses survive, but it opened the door for organized crime to move in. By 1940, mob-connected operators controlled most of the casinos in Reno and Lake Tahoe. Las Vegas was next, but Las Vegas in 1940 was nothing. Fremont Street had a few downtown casinos, the Golden Nugget, the El Cortez, the Pioneer Club, but they were small-time operations. The real action was still in Reno. The Las Vegas Strip didn't even exist yet. Highway 91, the two-lane road that ran south toward Los Angeles, was just empty desert. Then came Bugsy Siegel. Benjamin Siegel grew up in the same Brooklyn slums as Meyer Lansky. They were best friends, brothers in everything but blood. Together, they built the Bug and Meyer mob in the 1920s, a gang that ran bootlegging, extortion, and murder-for-hire operations across New York. Siegel was the muscle, charismatic, fearless, and psychotically violent. Lansky was the brains, calculating, disciplined, and always thinking 3 moves ahead. When Lucky Luciano formed the National Crime Syndicate in the 1930s, Lansky and Siegel became founding members. Siegel was sent to Los Angeles to oversee West Coast operations. He set up bookmaking networks, controlled the racing wire, and rubbed shoulders with Hollywood stars. He was handsome, charming, and dangerous, exactly the kind of man who thrived in the moral vacuum of 1940s Los Angeles. But Siegel wanted more. He wanted to build something. A monument. A palace in the desert that would prove the mob could operate in the open, legally, and make more money than they ever did bootlegging and extortion. In 1945, he found his opportunity. A small-time operator named Billy Wilkerson had started building a casino on Highway 91, just outside the Las Vegas city limits. He called it the Flamingo, after his girlfriend's nickname. But Wilkerson ran out of money, and Siegel bought him out, using mob money from Lansky, Luciano, and the commission. Siegel's vision was ambitious. He wanted the Flamingo to be more than a casino. It would be a luxury resort, world-class restaurants, a showroom for Hollywood entertainers, a spa, a golf course, everything a high roller could want. It would be so spectacular that people would drive 5 hours across the desert just to see it. Construction began in 1946, and almost immediately, everything went wrong. Building a casino in the middle of the desert in 1946 was a logistical nightmare. There were no supply chains, no skilled labor, no infrastructure. Every beam, every nail, every truckload of concrete had to be hauled in from Los Angeles or Phoenix. Costs spiraled out of control. What was supposed to cost $1.5 million ballooned to $6 million, an astronomical sum in 1946. And Siegel was skimming. He had contractors overbill for materials, then kick back the difference. He bought land through shell companies and resold it to the Flamingo at inflated prices. He was stealing from the men who backed him, convinced he could cover it once the casino opened and the money started rolling in. But the commission was watching, and they weren't happy. Lucky Luciano, exiled in Italy after being deported from the United States, sent word through Lansky, "Control Bugsy, make him stop spending, make him finish the project. If the Flamingo doesn't open soon and doesn't make money, we're pulling out." Lansky tried. He flew to Las Vegas, toured the construction site, and sat Siegel down for a long conversation about fiscal responsibility. Siegel swore he had everything under control. Just a few more months, just a little more money. It would all pay off. Lansky wanted to believe him, but the numbers didn't lie. December 26, 1946. The Flamingo Hotel and Casino opened to the public with a star-studded gala. Jimmy Durante performed. Xavier Cugat's orchestra played. Hollywood celebrities were flown in on chartered planes. It should have been a triumph. It was a disaster. The casino wasn't finished. Only the main building was open. No hotel rooms, no restaurants, no amenities. Guests couldn't stay overnight, so they gambled for a few hours and then drove back to Los Angeles. Worse, the weather was terrible. A rare winter storm hit Nevada, grounding flights and making the highway treacherous. Half the invited celebrities never showed up. And on top of everything, the casino lost money. The high rollers who did show up hit winning streaks. The dealers were inexperienced. The count room was disorganized. In the first 2 weeks, the Flamingo lost $300,000. Siegel panicked. He closed the casino in January 1947, promising to reopen once the hotel was finished. He begged the commission for more time. But by then, the bosses had made up their minds. Bugsy Siegel was no longer an asset. He was a liability who had burned through $6 million and had nothing to show for it. And in the mob, liabilities get eliminated. The contract was put out in May 1947. The commission voted. Even Meyer Lansky, Siegel's oldest friend, didn't object. Business was business. Friendship didn't matter when millions of dollars were on the line. On June 20th, 1947, Siegel was murdered in Beverly Hills. And within 20 minutes, Gus Greenbaum and Morris Rosen were walking through the doors of the Flamingo with orders from Lansky. Fix this. Make it work. Or we walk away from Vegas forever. Greenbaum understood the stakes. This wasn't just about saving the Flamingo. This was about proving that Las Vegas could work as a legitimate business model for the mob. If the Flamingo failed, the commission would abandon Nevada and focus on other markets: Havana, Hot Springs, illegal gambling in cities across America. But if it succeeded, Las Vegas could become the biggest moneymaker in the history of organized crime. Greenbaum got to work immediately. He fired half the staff. Most of them were stealing, pocketing chips, skimming from the count room, running scams on drunk tourists. Greenbaum brought in new dealers and pit bosses from Phoenix and Reno, men he knew personally, men who understood that loyalty meant something. He installed primitive surveillance cameras in the count rooms, clunky, expensive, but effective. In 1947, most casinos relied on armed guards and trust to protect their cash. Greenbaum didn't trust anyone. He wanted cameras recording every transaction, every dollar counted, every bag of chips moved from the tables to the vault. He adjusted the odds on the games. Not dramatically, you couldn't cheat customers and expect them to come back, but just enough to shift the house edge a few percentage points. A small change in blackjack rules here, a tweak to the craps table layout there. Most gamblers never noticed. But over thousands of bets, those tiny adjustments added up to massive profits. And most importantly, Greenbaum marketed the Flamingo as an experience, not just a casino. He brought in top-tier entertainers, singers, comedians, dancers, and paid them well. He upgraded the restaurants, stocked the bars with premium liquor, and trained the staff to treat high rollers like royalty. If you were a big spender, Greenbaum made sure you felt special. Complimentary rooms, free meals, tickets to sold-out shows, whatever it took to keep you gambling. Within 3 months, the Flamingo was turning a profit. By the end of 1947, the casino was clearing $300,000 a month. By 1948, it was pulling in $4 million a year. Meyer Lansky was ecstatic. The commission was satisfied, and Gus Greenbaum became a legend in the underworld, the man who saved the Flamingo, the man who proved Las Vegas could work. But success came with expectations. The mob didn't care about Greenbaum's operational genius. They cared about the skim. The skim was the untaxed cash that came off the top before anyone counted the official profits. Every night after the casino closed, the count room supervisors would gather the cash from the tables and slot machines. Most of it went into the official ledger, reported to the state of Nevada, taxed, and deposited in the bank. But a percentage, usually 10 to 20%, was skimmed off and never reported. That money went into locked bags and was delivered to mob couriers who flew it back to New York, Chicago, and Miami. No paperwork, no taxes, no trail. The skim was how the mob made real money. The Flamingo's official profits were good, but the skim was a fortune, and Gus Greenbaum was in charge of it. Meyer Lansky trusted him. The commission trusted him. And for a few years, Greenbaum earned that trust. He delivered the skim on time, every time. The numbers were always clean. The couriers were never stopped. The money flowed smoothly from the Flamingo's count room to the syndicate's coffers. But trust is a fragile thing, especially when drugs and gambling are involved. Greenbaum had always been a gambler. That's how he made his living. But there's a difference between professional gambling, calculating odds, managing risk, knowing when to walk away, and compulsive gambling, where the act itself becomes the addiction. By 1950, Greenbaum was crossing that line. It started innocuously. A few hands of blackjack after a long shift, a roll of the dice to unwind. Nothing serious, nothing that affected his judgment. But gambling, like any addiction, has a way of escalating. One hand becomes 10, 10 becomes 100, $100 becomes 1,000, and before you realize it, you're not gambling for fun anymore. You're gambling because you can't stop. Greenbaum started losing. Not small amounts, he could afford small losses, but big money. $5,000 in a single night, $10,000, $20,000. He was chasing losses, convinced the next bet would turn everything around. That's the gambler's delusion. The belief that the universe owes you a win because you've lost so much already. But the universe doesn't care. The house edge grinds you down, hand after hand, bet after bet, until there's nothing left. And then came the drugs. Greenbaum had suffered from chronic back pain for years, the result of an injury he sustained in the 1940s. The details are murky. Some accounts say it was a car accident. Others suggest it was an old boxing injury from his youth. Whatever the cause, the pain was constant, debilitating, a dull ache that radiated down his spine and into his legs. His doctors prescribed painkillers. In the 1950s, that meant opiates, morphine, codeine, later synthetic opioids like Demerol. There were no warnings about addiction. No one talked about dependency or withdrawal. You took the pills until the pain stopped, and if the pain never stopped, you kept taking the pills. Greenbaum kept taking the pills. By 1952, he was addicted. He needed the drugs just to function, just to get through the day. His hands shook when he went too long without a dose. He couldn't sleep without them, couldn't think clearly. The pain was always there, lurking in the background, and the only thing that dulled it was more pills. He started missing work, showing up late, making decisions that didn't make sense. The Flamingo's profits were still strong, but people noticed. The dealers whispered. The pit bosses exchanged glances. Something was wrong with Gus. And Meyer Lansky started hearing rumors. In 1953, Lansky called Greenbaum to New York. They met in a suite at the Waldorf Astoria, neutral ground, away from prying eyes and listening ears. Lansky didn't yell. He never yelled. That wasn't his style. He just asked questions. "How's the Flamingo doing, Gus? Are you feeling all right? Is there anything you need to tell me?" Greenbaum swore everything was fine. The Flamingo was profitable. The Skim was clean. He just needed some time to get back on his feet. Maybe take a vacation. Maybe see a doctor about his back. Lansky wanted to believe him. Gus had been reliable for years. He had saved the Flamingo when no one else could. You don't throw away a man like that because he's having a rough patch. But Lansky also sent someone to watch him. Just in case. Because in the mob, you don't gamble on loyalty. You verify. By 1955, the situation had deteriorated. Greenbaum wasn't just gambling. He was losing control. He was lending money from the Skim to high rollers who couldn't pay him back. He was extending credit to friends, to people he knew from Phoenix, to anyone who asked nicely. And he wasn't keeping proper records. This was catastrophic. The Skim wasn't Greenbaum's money. It belonged to Meyer Lansky, Lucky Luciano, Tony Accardo, and a dozen other bosses who had invested in the Flamingo. That money was supposed to be untouchable, inviolable, the one thing you never ever touched. But Greenbaum was dipping into it. A few thousand here to cover a gambling debt. A few thousand there to loan to a buddy who promised to pay it back. He told himself he was borrowing, not stealing. He told himself he'd replace it once his luck turned around. But his luck never turned around. The Chicago outfit started asking questions. Tony Accardo, the boss who had taken over after Al Capone went to prison, sent a representative to Las Vegas. Not to threaten. Not yet. Just to have a conversation. "Where's the money, Gus? The numbers don't add up. The Skim is light. Explain it to me." Greenbaum blamed bad luck. High rollers who hit winning streaks, market fluctuations, anything but the truth. Accardo's man didn't believe him, but he also didn't act. The mob had a rule. You don't kill a man who's making you money, even if he's skimming a little off the top. That's just the cost of doing business. But if he stops making you money, if he becomes a liability, then the calculus changes. And Gus Greenbaum was dangerously close to becoming a liability. In 1956, Meyer Lansky made a decision. He pulled Greenbaum off the Flamingo and sent him to run the Riviera Hotel, another mob-backed casino on the Strip. It was supposed to be a fresh start, a chance to prove he could still do the job without the pressure and temptation of the Flamingo. The Riviera was smaller, newer, less established. It should have been easier to manage. But by this point, Greenbaum was too far gone. The drugs had scrambled his judgment. The gambling had consumed his self-control. He was a shell of the man who saved the Flamingo in 1947. Within 6 months, the Riviera's profits collapsed. Greenbaum was gambling every night, sometimes losing $50,000 in a single session. He was taking painkillers around the clock, washing them down with scotch. His hands shook. His eyes were bloodshot. He looked like a man circling the drain, and he was still skimming, not for profit, not for greed. He was skimming to survive, borrowing from one casino's take to pay back another, running a shell game with mob money that could only end one way. The commission met in New York in the fall of 1958. Meyer Lansky, Tony Accardo, and the other bosses sat in a private room and discussed what to do about Gus Greenbaum. The conversation didn't last long. The decision was unanimous. Gus Greenbaum had to go. But it couldn't be a quiet death. It couldn't be a bullet in the back of the head in some alley. Greenbaum's murder had to send a message. It had to be brutal enough that every other casino operator, every other manager, every other mob associate who thought about skimming from the skim would understand. This is what happens when you steal from us. The contract was given to a crew from Chicago. Professionals. Men who knew how to kill without leaving evidence. But they were given specific instructions. Make it messy. Make it memorable. Make it a warning. November 1958. Gus and Bess Greenbaum returned to Phoenix. They were exhausted, beaten down by years of pressure, addiction, and paranoia. Gus knew he was in trouble. He had to know. The phone calls from New York had stopped. The couriers avoided eye contact. The pit bosses at the Riviera treated him like a ghost. But he also believed, like so many gamblers, that he could talk his way out of it. That one more big score would fix everything. That Meyer Lansky would give him one more chance. He spent Thanksgiving at home, trying to pretend everything was normal. He called his daughter in California. He went to the grocery store. He tried to sleep, but the pills didn't work like they used to. Nothing worked like it used to. On December 2nd, he told Bess he was tired. Just so tired. They went to bed early. Sometime after midnight, the killers entered the house through the back door. It's likely they had a key. Someone had given it to them. Someone Gus trusted. Someone from the old Phoenix crew, maybe. Or someone from the Riviera who owed the mob a favor. They moved silently through the living room, past the framed family photos on the mantel, down the hallway where the moonlight slanted through the windows. They knew the layout. They had been briefed. First bedroom on the left. Gus woke up to the feeling of a hand clamped over his mouth. He tried to fight, tried to scream, but he was weak, disoriented, still half asleep. The first cut opened his throat. Deep, efficient, severing the carotid artery. The second made sure he would never speak again. He bled out on the bedroom floor while Bess screamed in the next room. They killed her with the same knife. Just as brutally, just as final. She died trying to crawl toward the hallway, toward help that would never come. When police arrived at dawn, they found the bodies in separate rooms. Gus in the bedroom, his throat slashed so deeply the knife had hit bone. Bess in the hallway, her face and neck covered in stab wounds. Blood had pooled on the hardwood floors and soaked into the carpet. The murder weapon, a butcher knife from the kitchen, was left behind, wiped clean of prints. Phoenix Homicide called it the worst crime scene they had ever worked. The coroner estimated Gus had been stabbed and slashed more than 20 times. Bess, at least a dozen. It wasn't just murder. It was butchery, and it was meant to be. The newspapers called it a gangland slaying. The Phoenix police interviewed dozens of witnesses, but no one saw anything. No one heard anything. The investigation went nowhere. Meyer Lansky was in Miami. Tony Accardo was in Chicago. Every major mob figure had an alibi. The killers were never identified, never arrested, never charged. Because in 1958, the mob didn't get caught. Not in Phoenix, not in Vegas, not anywhere. But the murder of Gus Greenbaum changed everything. The Flamingo, the Riviera, the Sands, the Desert Inn, all of them were running the same system. A mob-backed operator managed the casino, skimmed cash off the top, and sent it back to the bosses in New York, Chicago, and Miami. It was enormously profitable. But it was also fragile. It depended on trust. It depended on discipline. And it depended on men like Gus Greenbaum not losing their minds. The problem was, gamblers and addicts can't be trusted. Siegel couldn't be trusted. Greenbaum couldn't be trusted. And the mob was starting to realize that running casinos with volatile, high-profile criminals was a recipe for disaster. So they changed the model. After Greenbaum's death, the mob started recruiting a different kind of manager: businessmen, accountants, men who didn't gamble, didn't use drugs, and didn't attract attention. The casinos became more corporate, more professional, more legitimate, at least on the surface. The real money still flowed to the mob, but now it was hidden behind layers of shell companies, union pension funds, and legitimate investors. The Teamsters Central States Pension Fund became the new source of financing. Jimmy Hoffa, the Teamsters president, loaned millions to mob-backed casinos. No questions asked, no oversight, just clean money with dirty strings attached. The Stardust, the Fremont, the Desert Inn. All of them were built or renovated with Teamsters money. And the skim continued. It just became harder to trace. Frank "Lefty" Rosenthal ran the Stardust in the 1970s, overseeing a skim operation that funneled millions back to the Kansas City and Chicago mobs. But Rosenthal didn't look like a mobster. He looked like a businessman. He wore suits, ran the casino like a corporation, and kept his name out of the papers. That was the model Gus Greenbaum's death created. The mob learned to hide in plain sight. By the 1960s, Las Vegas was booming. Frank Sinatra performed at the Sands. Elvis played the International. The Strip was lined with neon palaces that pulled in millions of dollars every month. And behind it all, the mob was still pulling the strings, quietly, carefully, invisibly. Gus Greenbaum's murder had taught them a valuable lesson. Don't put addicts in charge of the money. Don't trust gamblers to manage casinos. And don't kill someone unless you're prepared to send a message so brutal that no one forgets it. The FBI knew the mob was running Vegas. J. Edgar Hoover had agents embedded in every major casino, documenting the skim, tracking the money, building cases against the bosses. But proof was hard to come by. The mob had insulated itself behind layers of legitimate businesses, corrupt politicians, and complicit law enforcement. It would take another 2 decades, and the rise of the RICO Act in 1970, before the federal government could dismantle the mob's control of Las Vegas. Even then, it wasn't until the mid-1980s that the feds finally cracked the skim operations at the Stardust, the Fremont, and the Tropicana. By then, the model had evolved again. Corporate ownership, publicly traded companies. Steve Wynn, Kirk Kerkorian, and other legitimate businessmen bought out the mob's interests and transformed Las Vegas into a family-friendly destination. But the blueprint remained. The model Gus Greenbaum helped build in 1947, luxury casinos, high-end entertainment, and profits skimmed off the top, survived long after his death. The skim just got more sophisticated. The operators just got smarter. In Phoenix, the Greenbaum murders remain officially unsolved. The case file sits in a storage room somewhere, gathering dust, a relic of an era when the mob operated with impunity. No one was ever charged. No one ever will be. Bess Greenbaum's family buried her quietly. Gus was laid to rest in a Jewish cemetery in Phoenix, his gravestone simple and unremarkable. No flowers, no eulogy. No one from the mob attended the funeral. Meyer Lansky never spoke publicly about Greenbaum's death. Tony Accardo never acknowledged it. The message had been sent. There was nothing more to say. But the story of Gus Greenbaum is not just a story about a murdered gambler. It's a story about the fragility of criminal empires, the cost of addiction, and the brutal logic of organized crime. Greenbaum had everything: money, power, the trust of the most dangerous men in America, and he threw it all away because he couldn't stop gambling, couldn't stop chasing the next high, couldn't accept that the house always wins. Bugsy Siegel dreamed of building a palace in the desert, and it got him killed. Gus Greenbaum saved that palace, and it got him killed too. The mob didn't care about dreams or redemption or second chances. They cared about money. And when you stopped making them money, or worse, when you started stealing it, you became a problem that needed to be solved. Greenbaum's murder was that solution. Swift, brutal, and final. Today, the Flamingo still stands on the Las Vegas Strip, though almost nothing remains of the original building. It's been renovated, expanded, rebranded. The pink stucco walls are gone. The mob-era decor is gone. The rooms where Gus Greenbaum counted the skim and placed his doomed bets are buried under layers of drywall and tile. But walk into the Flamingo at 3 in the morning, when the casino floor is half empty and the dealers are bored, and you can still feel it. The ghosts of Siegel and Greenbaum, and all the men who built Las Vegas on blood money and broken promises. The slot machines still ring. The cards still shuffle. The roulette wheels still spin. And somewhere in a back office that tourists never see, accountants still count the money, still calculate the edge, still skim profits off the top. Legally now reported to the IRS, but the principle remains the same. The house always wins. The aftermath of Gus Greenbaum's murder rippled through the underworld like a shockwave. Within 48 hours, every mob-connected casino operator in Nevada got the message. Meetings were held in back rooms across the Strip. Phones rang in New York, Chicago, Miami, and Los Angeles. The conversation was always the same. Did you hear about Gus? Yeah, I heard. That's what happens when you get sloppy. The murder accomplished exactly what Meyer Lansky intended. It was a reset button, a reminder that the mob's patience had limits. More importantly, it forced a long overdue conversation about how Las Vegas should be run going forward. The old model, flashy criminals managing casinos, skimming profits, living large, was too visible, too risky, too dependent on unstable personalities. Bugsy Siegel had proven that. Gus Greenbaum had proven it again. The FBI was circling. Congress was holding hearings. Senator Estes Kefauver had spent 1950 and 1951 dragging mobsters in front of television cameras, exposing the syndicate's operations to millions of Americans. The mob needed to evolve or die. The solution came from an unlikely source, Jimmy Hoffa and the International Brotherhood of Teamsters. Hoffa was elected president of the Teamsters in 1957, just a year before Greenbaum's murder. He was brash, aggressive, and deeply corrupt. More importantly, he controlled the Teamsters Central States Pension Fund, a massive pool of money contributed by union members across the Midwest. That pension fund was supposed to provide retirement security for truck drivers, warehouse workers, and freight handlers. Instead, Hoffa turned it into a private bank for the mob. The arrangement was elegant in its simplicity. The mob wanted to build or buy casinos in Las Vegas, but legitimate banks wouldn't lend to known criminals. So Hoffa loaned them pension fund money, millions of dollars at a time, with minimal oversight and no background checks. The casinos got built, the mob got control, and Hoffa got kickbacks, political support, and favors he could call in later. The first major Teamsters loan went to the Stardust Hotel in 1958, the same year Greenbaum was murdered. It was a $1.5 million loan to expand the casino, and it came with strings attached. The mob would control the count room. They would hire the management. They would oversee the skim. But unlike the Flamingo or the Riviera, the Stardust didn't put a known mobster in charge. They hired Carl Thomas, a bland, competent businessman with no criminal record. On paper, he ran the casino. In reality, he took orders from Chicago, from This became the new template. Legitimate businessmen ran the day-to-day operations. Lawyers and accountants handled the paperwork. And behind the scenes, mob representatives, usually called consultants or advisors, made sure the skim kept flowing. It was brilliant. The casinos looked legitimate. The operators looked legitimate. And when the FBI came sniffing around, there was nothing to find. Just clean books, licensed managers, and corporate structures that buried the mob's involvement under layers of shell companies. But the skim itself didn't change. If anything, it got bigger. By the early 1960s, estimates suggest the mob was skimming between $7 million and $10 million a year from Las Vegas casinos. That's roughly $70 million to $100 million in today's dollars. And that was just from the skim. The official profits, reported, taxed, and legal, were even larger. Las Vegas had become the most profitable criminal enterprise in American history. More lucrative than bootlegging during Prohibition. More profitable than heroin smuggling or labor racketeering. And unlike those operations, the casinos were legal. The mob was making a fortune, and most of it was protected by Nevada state law. The FBI knew what was happening. Special Agent William Romer spent the 1960s documenting the Chicago outfit's control of Las Vegas casinos. He placed wiretaps, followed couriers, and interviewed informants. He built detailed files showing exactly how the skim worked, who counted the money, who transported it, and where it ended up. But knowing wasn't the same as proving. The mob's lawyers were too good, the paper trail was too clean, and Nevada politicians had no interest in shutting down the industry that funded their state. So the skim continued, month after month, year after year. Millions of dollars flowing from Las Vegas count rooms to mob bosses in a dozen cities. And Gus Greenbaum's murder hung over it all like a cautionary tale. This is what happens when you get greedy. This is what happens when you steal from us. The warning worked. For nearly 2 decades after Greenbaum's death, there were no major mob hits in Las Vegas. Casino operators kept their heads down, delivered the skim on time, and didn't make waves. The system functioned smoothly because everyone remembered what happened to Gus and Bess. But by the mid-1970s, the FBI had finally figured out how to crack the code. The breakthrough came from an unlikely source, a small-time hood named Frank Collada, who worked for Tony Spilotro, the Chicago outfit's enforcer in Las Vegas. Spilotro was the real-life inspiration for Joe Pesci's character in the movie Casino, violent, unpredictable, and arrogant. He ran a burglary ring, a loan-sharking operation, and provided muscle for the casinos. But Spilotro made mistakes. He attracted attention. He killed people in ways that made headlines. He was the exact opposite of the low-profile model the mob had adopted after Greenbaum's death. In 1982, Frank Collada got arrested and decided to cooperate with the FBI. He told them everything, how the skim worked, who was involved, where the money went. He wore a wire. He testified before grand juries. And slowly, methodically, the FBI built RICO cases against the mob's operations in Las Vegas. The indictments came down in the mid-1980s. Dozens of mob figures were charged with racketeering, skimming, and conspiracy. The trials dragged on for years, but the result was inevitable. The mob's control of Las Vegas was broken. By 1990, legitimate corporations owned most of the major casinos. Steve Wynn built the Mirage in 1989, a $630 million resort financed entirely by junk bonds, with no mob involvement whatsoever. Kirk Kerkorian bought MGM Grand. Sheldon Adelson built the Venetian. Las Vegas transformed from a mob town into a corporate theme park. The era that began with Bugsy Siegel's dream and Gus Greenbaum's execution finally came to an end. But the ghosts remain. In 2006, the FBI released its files on the Greenbaum murder. Thousands of pages of reports, interviews, and surveillance records. The documents confirmed what everyone already suspected. The hit was ordered by the Commission, carried out by Chicago hitmen, and covered up by corrupt Phoenix police officers who were on the mob's payroll. The files named names. They detailed the planning, the execution, and the aftermath. But no one was ever charged. The killers were dead. The bosses were dead. The statute of limitations had long since expired. The case remains officially unsolved, a bureaucratic footnote in the FBI's archive of mob murders. Gus Greenbaum's story is rarely told outside of mob history circles. He doesn't have the name recognition of Bugsy Siegel or Al Capone. There are no movies about him, no best-selling books, no mythology. But in many ways, he's more important than any of them. Siegel was a dreamer who built something he couldn't control. Capone was a gangster who ruled through violence and intimidation. Lansky was a genius who built the syndicate's financial empire. But Greenbaum was the guy who actually made it work. He was the mechanic, the technician, the operator who understood that running a casino wasn't about flash or reputation. It was about math, discipline, and knowing when to walk away. His tragedy was that he couldn't follow his own rules. He couldn't walk away. He kept gambling, kept chasing, kept believing that the next bet would save him. And in the end, the house collected. There's a saying in Las Vegas whispered by old-timers who remember the mob days. The desert remembers. They're talking about the bodies. The men who crossed the wrong people, made the wrong bets, said the wrong things. The desert outside Las Vegas is full of unmarked graves. Mobsters, gamblers, informants, all buried in shallow holes where the sand and scrub brush hide everything. Gus Greenbaum wasn't buried in the desert. He got a proper funeral, a marked grave, a place where his family could mourn. But in every other way, he disappeared. His name was erased from casino records. His role in building Las Vegas was forgotten. The mob made sure of that, because Greenbaum's story was an embarrassment, a reminder that the system wasn't perfect, that even the best operators could fall apart, that addiction and weakness could destroy everything. Better to forget, better to move on, better to pretend it never happened. But history doesn't forget. The documents remain, the FBI files, the newspaper archives, the testimony of men like Frank Collada who lived through it and survived to tell the story. And more importantly, Las Vegas itself is a monument to Gus Greenbaum's legacy. Every casino on the Strip today, every resort, every poker room, every sportsbook, operates on principles Greenbaum helped establish. The house edge, the skim, now called hold percentage, and reported to regulators. The comp system that rewards high rollers with free rooms and meals. The surveillance cameras that watch every transaction. Greenbaum didn't invent any of those things, but he refined them. He proved they could work at scale. He showed the mob that casinos could be more profitable than any other racket they'd ever run. And then he died for it. December 3rd, 1958, 5:42 in the morning, Phoenix, Arizona. A butcher knife rests on a blood-soaked carpet in a ranch house at 440 East Baseline Road. Two bodies. Two lives that began in poverty and ambition, that rose through the criminal underworld, that built an empire in the desert and then fell apart when discipline gave way to addiction. The killers are long dead. The bosses who ordered the hit are long dead. The FBI agents who investigated are long dead. But the Flamingo still stands. The lights still shine. The tourists still come, chasing the same dream that drew Bugsy Siegel and Gus Greenbaum to the desert 70 years ago. The dream that you can beat the odds, that you can win, that this time will be different. It never is. The house always wins. And in Las Vegas, the house was built on blood.